New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hi there, I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought's Roots and Branches. And we've been going through these teachers that have been developing and teaching each other and learning from each other and growing and discovering. And today we're going to talk about a teacher who wasn't part of the network of American teachers. This is a man who was born in India, was British, went to England, studied, passed the exams, and went back to India. Thomas Troward. And we're going to call this particular teaching the creative process. Thomas did not set up a school. Thomas did not set up any form of institution to progress his teachings. But almost every one of the founders, and particularly Ernest Holmes, who we'll learn about later, built their ideas on the logic and clear presentation that Judge Thomas Troward gave them. So if we look at the map of the various teachers, we can see there was all that ancient work and then all the Europeans, and then off over here all by himself with basically no input except from the Hindu, Muslim, and Christian traditions, we have Thomas Troward. And if you look at the next map, you can see that in the look at most of the modern teachers, he's actually pretty near the beginning of thinking. And we will see how other teachers are affected by him as we go forward. Get a look at how he looked after he had retired from India in the next slide. We have one where he's looking at us and one where he's looking ahead. The one that's a sepia tone or a slightly colored picture is a little younger than the other one, but very much the 19th century magistrate that Thomas had been trained to be and had done for a long time in India. So let's look at his early life. In the next slide, we find that he was born in 1847. Now, you may remember that the people that were in the U.S., the Fillmores, Emma, Emily, Mary Baker Eddy, were all born about the same time. But where they were learning from each other in this country, he was growing up in Ceylon, which we call Sri Lanka today. And he had all of the appropriate household help that any British military family would have in that time. So we would have a Hindu ayah singing Hindu chants in the Hindi language as he was being very, very small. And he would have other people who were either Buddhist or Hindu working in the house, providing the foods, keeping things clean, keeping up the garden. And he heard those languages all of his life. When he was getting to be 12, 13, 14, it was time to send him off for proper schooling in England. And so he would spend what we call our middle school years, high school and college years, all in England, never going home, never getting to see the family he grew up with. And he did quite well given the fact that he would rather paint pictures and write poetry than do his homework. He did well enough, though, to get into law school. The family insisted that he had to have a trade, and that family, that he was of a class where there were no tradesmen. You had to be a professional, and that meant being an attorney. But what that did is open the door for him. And in the next slide, we see that he was able to take the civil service, the foreign service exam, which was called the civil service exam because at that time India was considered part of the British Empire. But it really was the exam for moving out into other countries. And he took the exam and he did quite well. But then the examiner actually questioned him about his answers to the questions about metaphysics. Now, here's a kid who grew up with Hindu and Buddhist folks around him, heard prayers and pujas and meditation chants all of his childhood, then came into the British school system, which is based on the Anglican religion, very, very Christian, very high church. And so he has some rather interesting ideas about the nature of ourself. Metaphysics, although it accurately could be translated as beyond the physical, it usually is applied to what is it that I am being, I am seeing, I am feeling about the world around me. So they were surprised at it, but they accepted it. So we get that from very early on, Thomas Troward was asking and answering questions in a slightly different way from the people around him. He was sent to northern India. Now, some records say that he was born in the Punjab, but all the evidence I could find was that he grew up in the Ceylon area. So it's possible that he was born and then his family was transferred. Whatever it was, he spent his career in the Punjab, and that's really where all the work is that we're going to talk about. What is the Punjab? It's an area in northern India with a big melting pot. And he was having to work with all kinds of languages and religious traditions in order to do his job. When he got the job, he got married. He didn't want to marry before he was able to support a wife. And they were moved into a house in the Punjab very soon after they were married. So the story goes, as Thomas tells it, that they moved into the house and they were, he and his wife were in the beds that are in India, which are basically a wooden frame with a rope net and then a light cotton padding because you want the air to move through you in a hot climate. You want that flow. And then they were surrounded by mosquito netting. And she was sitting up reading while he was rolling over and going to sleep. And he had just drifted off when his wife is suddenly screaming. "Did you hear that shot?" she says. And he didn't hear a thing. And she's shaking. She's just terrified and upset. And he calms her down. And finally, she's able to tell him that a man came into the room and stood by their bed. It stood where she was, right next to her, where she was sitting up reading, and said, "Don't worry. Everything will be fine." And then shot himself right there. And then the whole thing disappeared. Now, initially, Thomas said, "You must have been dreaming." And she said, "Oh, no, I wasn't dreaming. This was real." Well, because she had screamed, the houseboys came running in, the caretakers for the property came running in, and were wanting to make sure that the sahibs were okay. "Mem Sahib, are you okay? You screamed," right? And they decided to change rooms just in case something might come of this experience. They changed rooms, had a perfectly quiet night. Everything went well. And then the next day, the owner of the property that had been rented to them came to have tea with them and to make sure everything was okay. She was a widow in her late 50s. She had grown up in the area. She had married a military man in the area. And after some consideration, the Trowards decided to share their story. She said, "Is everything okay? Is everything else?" And they said, "Well, it was perfect. We love the home. We love everything about it. Thank you so much. But the oddest thing happened last night." and they shared their story. And as they're sharing the story, the woman turns incredibly pale and begins to be a little shaky. And she says, "That was my husband. That's exactly what he did on the night that he died." And so the Trowards were introduced to the Punjab, where if you think New Mexico is the land of enchantment, you ought to try the Punjab in India. It was the beginning of many, many, many paranormal experiences and the beginning of Thomas Troward's search for answers. So we go on to the next slide, and we find that in the process of doing so, he realizes that the Bible had some of the answers, and as he grew older, he studied the Bible more and more fully. But he also, because he was working and presiding over lawsuits among Hindus and Jains and Sikhs and Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and Christians and all these people, he began to learn their languages and study their scriptures and understand their belief systems. My grandmother moved to India about 10 years after Troward returned. No, about 20 years after Troward returned. And she also lived in the Punjab for some of that time. And she saw these men and these teachers and these what were called fakirs, those are the Muslim holy men, would be able to do incredible things. And when I was growing up, she was back in the States. And when I was a little girl, she would tell me stories. And so I know for sure that Thomas Troward must have experienced these stories because they were on the streets in the towns across the Punjab region. And some of them were of a man who had been born blind, now able to see, or someone whose leg had been badly broken, healed right there on the street. Not to mention all the other stories we hear about sleeping on beds of nails and cobra dancing and all that other thing. So healing was happening around him. And what we would call miraculous events were going on all the time around Troward as he was building his life with his wife in the Punjab. So he really wanted to understand what that was about. He read the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. He read the Maharana, which is a story of the unfolding of the miraculous presence of Krishna in people's lives. He read a lot of the Buddhist sutras. He read the Jewish Old Testament, of course, but he got hold of Torah and read it in the Hebrew and on and on. He studied those religions as fully as possible to find out what was going on. In the next slide, we see that after a time, after about 20 years, actually, he and his family began to go through a rough period. And where there was an illness. It was kind of like COVID. It was a pandemic. It ran across India and thousands of people died. And unfortunately, Thomas's wife and children died in India. And very soon thereafter, he retired. He said, I think I've had enough. So he retired, and after kind of traveling around and closing things up and coming to his senses around a whole bunch of things, getting over the grief, he returned to England in 1902. He moved into London, and he started to write. He started to write all of these thoughts, all of these ideas, all of these experiences into some possibly coherent form. Now, remember, this is a judge. He's used to logical arguments based on evidence. And so guess what he's going to write? Logical arguments based on evidence. And that then began to lead to the explanation. It also, unfortunately, led to even more paranormal events. One of those was described when he was looking for a nanny for his new children with his new wife. They moved to Cornwall and they had a home. And his wife put an advertisement in the London paper, which is what everyone did in England. It didn't matter what part of England you lived in, your ad was in the London paper. And someone answered, sent a letter saying that they would be coming to interview with her. Well, in between her sending in the letter, the announcement for the job, and the person coming to interview, Thomas is sitting at his desk writing away. He's in that kind of half hypnagogic state you sometimes get into when you are thinking about things and writing words and, trying to get it all figured out. And he looks up and he sees a woman, two women, coming in the front door, looking around, going up the stairs, looking around, coming back down the stairs and leaving. My, that was strange. But he was in his den. His wife was in charge of the house at that point. He figured that was supposed to be what was going on, and he went back to his writing. Within a week, the new candidate showed up with her mother. Well, her mother didn't come inside. Her mother stayed in the carriage. The candidate came in and was greeted by Mrs. Troward, was shown around the house, and was absolutely clear, oh yes, absolutely, this would be perfect. And the two of them worked out a lovely deal. Well, it took some time before Thomas was willing to trust her enough to ask how it was that she knew to come to the home and look at it before she actually arrived physically. And he asked how her mother was, whom she had never mentioned. That gave the proof to his experience, and she was blown away. But by that time, she had seen enough of him to know that he was a reasonably sane, sensible man. So something must have actually happened here. But she was wearing exactly the same clothing that he had seen. This kind of story is written in several of Thomas's books, particularly The Law and the Word, that we'll talk about here shortly. Moving to Cornwall, next scene, is very much like moving to the Oregon coast, except there are more little inlets. But it's bluffs and hills and trees above the ocean. And Cornwall includes a little bit of east-facing ocean, but it's mostly west and southwest. So those of you who live in Oregon will have a sense of what it is like to have moved to Cornwall. And the place that they were located was in a village where he could walk easily to one of those beaches that we can see in this 1914 photograph of the Cornwall coast. In the next slide, we learned that while he was in London, whenever he visited London, he would sit in a tea shop and write. And one time, along about 1912, I think it was 1912 and 1914, right in that period, he was sitting and writing in very scrawling handwriting on legal tablets, of course, because he was a lawyer. And in a tea shop at that time, and still in some parts of England, if you're sitting at a table and there isn't any other opening, someone might ask to join you. And a very nice woman asked to join him, and he's writing away. And after a time, she finally says, "Excuse me for interrupting, but it looks to me as if you are writing a higher thought." And he looks at him. He looks at the lady across the table and he says, "Well, I'd like to believe this is a higher than usual thought." Well, it turns out she's the secretary of the newly formed Society of Higher Thought that meets just down the street. And, well, she's having a bit of tea before the meeting. So she introduces him to the group and he tells them a little bit about what he's writing about. They get very, very, very excited. They ask him to tell more, and then they set up a series of lectures, the Edinburgh Lecture Series. Now, most of us who've been introduced to Thomas Troward, this is the book we were introduced to. And it's pretty intense. It's so intense that when he got up and gave those lectures in Edinburgh, people would listen and they couldn't follow the incredibly complex combination of language they were hearing that was delivered in a monotone, like a court sentence rather than like a story or a lecture might be from a platform speaker, right? So they were having a hard time with it. And yet, when they saw it in writing, they were so blown away. They would attend, they would come back again and again. So there was another series created, the Dore lecture series, and waiting with bated breath to see the written versions so they'd understand what it was they'd heard. Well, those two series were made into books, and those were received very well. As you look into the next slide, they were received all over the world very well. In the US, in England, of course, and Canada, Australia, but then they began to be translated into other languages. And this set, the Edinburgh Lectures, the Dore Lectures, his book, The Creative Process in the Individual, which is what he says, God dwelling within us, that's his language for it. And then The Law and the Word and The Hidden Power, those 5 were published while he was alive. And then the last one, The Hidden Mysteries, is the one that his wife published after he passed away. But he had shared a lot of those essays in other forms. He did a lot of writing, but that was normal for a Victorian gentleman who had retired from the Foreign Service at that time. In our next slide, we see that he was so well received that he was declared the vice president at the 1914 meeting of the International New Thought Alliance. And when the philosopher William James, the American philosopher who wrote a history of religion based on psychology, so he was a philosopher psychologist at Harvard, said this about the lectures, the book that was the lectures, the Edinburgh Lectures: far and away, the ablest statement of philosophy I have met. Beautiful in its sustained clearness of thought and style, a really classic statement. Now, for all the poor New Thought ministry students who have struggled with the Edinburgh Lectures, that must be very hard to hear. The ablest and clearest, beautiful in its sustained clearness, right? But truly it is. You have to kind of get into his mindset. You have to understand a little bit about Victorian English. And frankly, I got a little bit scared when I was asked to translate Thomas Troward's Victorian prose into modern English. But I did, and I have produced a volume called The Creative Process, or the Creative Power of Thought, Thomas Troward's Metaphysics. So I took some of the Edinburgh Lectures and some of his other writings, and some that were published after he passed on, and wrote them in modern English. And you can find that online anywhere else. If you've had trouble with Troward, try my book as a start. Then you'll be fine. He'll be clear as a bell. I don't guarantee it, but I assure you it probably is. So in the next slide, we see that there actually was an INTA Congress in London in 1914. And notice that it's almost all ladies, which actually fits the bill, given that we know that Emma Curtis Hopkins was there, Emily Cady was there, Nona Brooks was there, and a number of others were there to help create this international alliance of people who were thinking in this new way about their relationship with the divine. Not new historically, but new culturally. Our culture was based on there being a God out there who didn't have anything to do with us except as a judge of our behaviors. And these people are saying, no. We need to have a different relationship with the divine. And they were very well attended. In fact, INTA meetings have at sometimes drawn thousands and thousands of people. I know the first time I attended one along about 1982, thereabouts, there were 3,000 or 4,000 people attending, and there was a whole lecture hall full of tables full of books and such. So yes, many people attending INTA. It has diminished over the years, and we'll see what happens in the future. But in 1914, it was launched. and included England, Canada, the US, and Australia at that beginning stage, and now includes, people from many countries all over the world. In the next slide, we can see what it is that people really, really understood and appreciated about Troward. In fact, when I was first taught that Troward was an important contributor to New Thought, this is the only thing I was given. My mind is a center of divine operation. The divine operation is always for expansion and fuller expression. And this means the production of something beyond what has gone before, something entirely new, not included in past experience, though proceeding out of it by an orderly sequence of growth. Therefore, since the divine cannot change its inherent nature, it must operate in the same manner with me. Consequently, in my own special world, of which I am the center, it will move forward to produce new conditions, always in advance of any that have gone before. Now, if any of you saw the film, What the Bleep Do We Know?, you may recall that there was one of the interviewees was Dr. Joe Dispenza. At the time, he was working on his PhD in physics, having been a chiropractor and studied neurophysiology. He's now practicing neurophysiology in a huge way. But during the production of that movie, he got on and he said, every day I go inside and I tell myself, my higher self, create something wonderful for me today. Create something that is absolutely unexpected, so I know that it wasn't my own ego that was creating this. And this is very much in alignment with what Troward was telling us. In our world, in fact, you can say in physics, the universe extends infinitely in all directions from each of us. Each of us is the center of the universe. Isn't that beautiful? And the divine nature working in us and through us, that creative process that is in the universe and in the individual, in Thomas Troward's thinking, is always doing the same thing. It's always expanding its own self. It's always bringing more and more of what it is into every being and every situation. So, recognizing that my mind is a center of that creative process and that it's always for more expansion and fuller expression, then I must expect my life not to be something that is shutting down, not to be something that is getting narrower and narrower, but my life must be moving into greater expansion and fuller expression, always in the good, in an orderly sequence of growth. It may seem to jump, but that's kind of like a quantum leap where you've been preparing, and then the opportunity comes and now I'm operating up here, right? That's all the appearance of the jump is. When it's a sudden change, if you look back, you can see it's been an orderly progression of growth. In my own special world of which I am the center, I am surrounded by the things that are reflecting back to me my current state of consciousness. How could it be otherwise, right? So that creative process in and through me is constantly filtering through me what it is that it is creating. And if my consciousness is in alignment with its nature, then what is being created is very much in alignment with its nature. But if I'm focusing on fears and upsets and distresses, or if my belief systems are not in the area or not in alignment with what the divine is, then what is created in and through and around me may not be in alignment with what the divine is, or as close as possible to what the divine can make happen, given the filter of who and what I am being. So it will move forward to produce new conditions, always in advance of whatever have gone before. if it has been fearful and upsetting, it will produce more of that, only more so of that, ever more, right? Oh dear. And if it has been open and loving and exploring and discovering and caring and beautiful and harmonious, then there's a lot more of that to come. So that's the essence of that core statement that all of us New Thought students got in seminary. But there's a lot more to what Troward is about. Let's go on to his main concepts in the next slide. Basically, he is saying the universe is made up of two things. There is movement or motion, and there is thought. And he talks about all of that in his books. He lays out the process. And he ultimately comes to, in his logical process, that they together make up the activity of spirit, movement, and thought, which is universal. So he's saying whatever we have called God in the past, whatever name we've given it, it is actually a universal spirit. And he's saying that the spirit in the infinite, this universal infinite spirit, is the creative power. It is the creative process. And it expresses itself in many individual forms, including each of us. And he goes on and he says, because I am what I am, I may be what I will to be, right? I am that spirit in individualized form. So I may be whatever I choose. I use the divine will to be, right? If we go on, he says, my individuality is one of the modes in which the infinite expresses itself. And therefore, I am myself, that very power which I find to be the innermost within of all things. There's no separation. I am that which is within all beingness and all things, even if it looks like stuff, furniture, looks like plants, looks like fungi, looks like plastic in the ocean. I am what is in the innermost of all of it. And then he goes on to say, we need to understand that spirit always follows principles. And those principles, that orderly progressive growth, principles of various things that he came to name, things like the law of attraction, the law of causation, the law of cause and effect, and so on. He's the one who gave all those names. Anyway, those principles are universal and eternal. Once you understand a principle, it applies everywhere, across space and time. It's outside of time, not just limited by time. And we go on to the next slide. We get a little more of that. As he says, the life and substance of all things must first subsist as images in the divine mind before they can come into manifestation in the world of time and space. And he compares that to Plato's conception of archetypal ideas. So all of us in New Thought are called Neoplatonists because we accept that idea that there is some perfect form that exists outside of space and time that begins to take form in space and time. And then in the next point, whatever we believe does for us in very fact exist. Our beliefs may be erroneous from the point of view of a happier belief, but this does not alter the fact that for ourselves, our beliefs are our realities, and these realities must continue until some ground is found for a change in belief. Now, in the New Testament, we're told that Jesus said, "It shall be as you believe." And we're told that in the context of someone seeking healing. Troward took it the next step. Whatever it is we are believing, we must experience. There's no other way because these principles are universal and eternal. Our belief system is the filter through which the creative process is creating our bodies and our worlds. If you want to know what you believe, look at your body and look at your world. If it's about beauty and harmony, you will see it. If it's about distress and chaos, you will see it. And that's why when we were studying Emma Hopkins, she was saying, if you want to have a different world, start affirming the possibility of what that world can be, right? And deny, negate, dissolve the beliefs otherwise. As we go on then, what we're looking at in the next slide is how that creative process works. He explains in one of his books that the universe is created because universal spirit contemplates itself. Then through this orderly set of principles and processes that is always expanding and always for the betterment of the whole and every individual within the whole, it is contemplating itself. We contemplating ourselves, our being spirit contemplating itself. The infinite all that is contemplating itself comes forth as interesting possibilities that include us. And then he points out that the starting point is always here and now. And in the mode of thought, this point of origination, here and now, is where spirit's power to produce something out of nothing is existent, is the experience. So we know from way back from Fred Hoyle as the physicist that there have been matter just popping out of the quantum field for forever. And that matter popping out of the quantum field could be considered the universal spirit experiencing itself as more matter. It also experiences itself as energy. It also experiences itself as the accumulation of matter, energy, and information in all kinds of systems. All right? To produce something out of nothing, and that it does this in accordance with the natural order of substance of the particular world in which it is working. He talks in some of his books about what it'd be like to be on a different planet and say, it'd be different over there. But here it works like this because we are on this world. This world has developed according to certain principles and processes, and therefore what emerges here is going to be in alignment with those principles and processes. Thomas loved the sciences. He was very interested in electricity, and by the time he passed away, the Copenhagen decision and Einstein's relativity, were beginning to be talked about in the world. He was very much interested in all of that, as we saw later with Charles Fillmore, or we heard about before, but he was actually writing a little later than this. And as we work with Troward's understanding, he demonstrates over and over again in the science of radio waves, in the science of cymatics, which is usually displayed as sand on a plate that's vibrating, and the frequency of the vibration changes the pattern of the sand. It's kind of cool. And he talks about that, and he talks about being able to modify the pattern based on will. And that was a major experiment that he was excited about. He talks about being able to have electricity flow through to light bulbs or not bulbs, not light them. He played a lot in the sciences in order to have the evidence and the logic lead to an explanation that worked for him. And this is where he got to the only way that the infinite all that is could show up in form is by contemplating itself and possibilities in the process. This is very similar in some ways to the Taoist creation story, where the if you imagine this, the self, the unveiling, the whole beingness, the universe, whatever, the source of all that is. If you imagine that source is like a sun, and there's this ray, and this ray looks back and goes, "Oh, I'm separated." And then out of that, all the stuff comes. Well, that's a form of self-contemplation, isn't it? All right. The next slide tells us then the implications of all this for our health, right? So the spiritual ego in ourselves, because he didn't separate small self from great self. He didn't separate personality from, in any of those other separations that Freud came along with just about the same time. But he called it ego, that I am, that is my spiritual self, right? As proceeding direct from the universal spirit should be able, he says, first, to harmoniously combine the working of spiritual and physical laws in the body to keep us in perfect health. Can you see how that would be so? If I'm operating without beliefs that are preventing it, right? That life, that love, that beingness, that pure beingness would show up as perfect health. Secondly, he says that it should be able to renew the body, because if I'm not blocking it with beliefs that say I can't have that happen, then that would happen. The cells would line up on the true nature of the spirit that we are at core. And thirdly, he suggests that it carries the process still further and perpetuates the renewed body as long as the individual might desire. Now, we know that there are many cultures in which people live well into their hundreds, where they're very physically active, well into their 90s and hundreds. And then one day, the man or woman decides, I'm kind of done. And they go and they lay their body down and they're done. Isn't that interesting? Much in alignment with what he was teaching. In the next slide, that we see that illness results from the belief that some material form or substance is a cause or entity that can cause disease or distress. This is the Course in Miracles saying the same thing in the 60s, for what that's worth. And he says, but our knowledge of universal spirit tells us there is only one primary cause, and it is universal spirit. That is the only cause. And again, that's what the Course in Miracles teaches us: spirit, soul, mind, body. Each of those is affected by the previous layer. All our life, he says in the third point, we have been holding to the false belief in sickness as a primary cause. And he says the appearance of illness then is based on a belief, and the basis of all healing is a change in belief. And this is precisely where Quimby and Eddy and Hopkins and all those people came to in their own path on the other side of the world from India, where Troward was developing his ideas. And when he came to it through his own line of reasoning, his own logic, they were able to build on that in future work. And their students were too. So in the next slide, we see that the process of healing then is reducing that block, right? He says because the subconscious mind, the mind that is actually running the body, is directly linked with universal spirit and accepts whatever it is told precisely as it is presented. And a lot of us have heard about that. Don't say negative things to the subconscious because it only hears precisely the thing, or the subconscious doesn't know a joke, right? Those kinds of things. Second point, placing an idea in the subconscious mind, that is on the plane of the absolute, without reference to time and space, is not the same as placing the same idea in the conscious intellectual mind, which only perceives things as related to time and space. And sometimes we talk about that as this idea internalized yet? Has it gone into the heart? Have I really got this idea? Heinlein used to say, do you grok this idea? So he points out in the third point, a way to know that you are working on this level of mind is to experience the limitless state immediately before or during taking action. If you're feeling that limitless state, then you are in fact reaching that subconscious that we both share, that mind that is the one mind in and through and all beings. And he points out that it may take several times to eliminate those layers of blockages against this opening until at last, he says, a permanent cure is experienced. Well, Thomas was an effective healer, an amazing writer, and the time came when he was pretty much done. He continued to paint, and he did beautiful watercolors. I cannot find one online. I'm really looking for one because everyone says they were lovely. They won awards in India. When I was in India, I was looking for them, couldn't find any. But he really loved seascapes because of the infinite quality and the light, and the way the light played on the water. In fact, during World War II, because in 1914, World War I, 1914 was the beginning of World War I, he would sometimes just head out with his paints without really thinking about it. And the Civil Patrol would have to come and say, Judge Troward, no, we can't have you documenting what's going on the coast right now. And they'd pull him back in. And finally, in May of 1916, he gave up and he died in his sleep. And his wife went through his papers and proceeded to publish many of the things that he had not either got around to or didn't quite believe that people would appreciate. And so there we have the life and teachings of Thomas Troward. In English, he's Troward, the creative process in and through all that is. Thank you for joining me here today. It's been a delight to share another root and branch of the New Thought movement. Have a lovely week. Bye.